Before tobacco made its smoky debut in polite society, the human race seemed perfectly content puffing on nearly everything else. Dried herbs, vaguely suspicious resins, and once, during a particularly questionable Roman dinner party, someone may have tried inhaling boiled cabbage fumes. We've always been a bit odd in our desire to set things on fire and breathe them in. But let's begin where it matters. Long before corner stores and warning labels, tobacco was a sacred plant, not a convenience item. The first people to truly embrace it weren't Europeans. They were indigenous peoples of the Americas. Long before Sir Walter Raleigh thought it looked terribly fashionable, tribes across North and South America were cultivating, drying, and smoking tobacco, not for recreation, but for ceremony, prayer, and storytelling. Smoking was a cultural ritual, not a way to look brooding at cafes in the rain, which came a few centuries later. Imagine yourself in the highlands of Peru about 5,000 years ago. Yes, 5 whole millennia before Instagram filters, where archaeologists discovered the oldest known traces of cultivated tobacco. Back then, tobacco was more a sacred smoke than a rebellious puff. Shamans would use it to communicate with the spirit world, or to clear the air, both spiritually and possibly also from someone's questionable llama stew. Fast forward to the late 1400s. Columbus arrives in the Americas, thoroughly confused by everything, including the local people offering him burning bundles of leaves. It wasn't gold, but the Europeans were intrigued. They didn't quite understand what the plant was, but they noticed something important. The locals seemed very calm when smoking it, suspiciously calm, possibly too chill for people being colonized. And so, tobacco took the scenic voyage across the Atlantic, arriving in Europe with all the mystical buzz of a new miracle plant. In 1492, Rodrigo de Jerez, one of Columbus's crew members, brought the habit of smoking back to Spain. His neighbors were horrified. Smoke coming out of a man's mouth looked suspiciously demonic. So naturally, he was thrown in prison, not for smoking indoors, but for consorting with the devil via his oddly aromatic mouth smoke. But while poor Rodrigo was enduring medieval jail time for hotboxing the living room, the rest of Europe got curious. Soon, tobacco sniffing, chewing, and eventually smoking became the aristocratic fashion equivalent of wearing 3 collars at once. Smoking pipes were long and elegant, like early versions of a smartphone. Except instead of playing games, they gave you a light dose of nicotine and something to do with your hands during long theological lectures. By the 1600s, smoking was less shamanic vision quest and more Tuesday. The English developed an enthusiastic relationship with tobacco, with King James III himself writing an entire pamphlet against it in 1604, or what we would now recognize as the first anti-smoking campaign. He called it a counterblast to tobacco, and he was delightful in his contempt, referring to smoking as a custom loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, dangerous to the lungs, and in the black stinking fume thereof nearest resembling the horrible Stygian smoke of the pit that is bottomless. Hard to misinterpret that really, but much like any trend loathed by a king, it flourished in response. Pipes clinked merrily in taverns, portraits featured proud puffs of smoke, and an entire colonial economy bloomed around the cultivation and trade of tobacco. By the early 1700s, Caribbean plantations were exporting it en masse, having found that tobacco not only soothed the nerves but paid the bills, especially when one was wearing 6 layers of brocade and debt. It's worth noting, though, that cigarettes, the slim, papery torchbearers of 20th century cool, weren't yet a thing. Pipe tobacco, cigars, chewing tobacco, and snuff were the fancies of the day. Cigarettes as we know them were still an idea gently snoozing in history's coat pocket, waiting for a match. So next time you see an old oil painting of a gentleman with a solemn look and a long pipe, remember he might have just been trying to keep his dinner warm, or he was philosophizing, which, in the 1600s, required both a pipe and a lot of frowning. Now, if these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Tonight, as the world quiets and the smoke of history rises gently in the background, rest easy knowing that even something as ordinary as lighting up once had a beginning, a sacred smoky one at that. Imagine, for a moment, a world without lighters or ashtrays, no matches with their satisfying scratch, no convenience stores with vending machines full of identical paper-wrapped sticks, just wide skies, damp earth, and an occasional leaf smouldering stubbornly in someone's hand. Before the cigarette became synonymous with smoky rebellion, noir film stars, and awkward teenage experimentation behind dumpsters, it was just a leaf being lit on fire by someone who thought that seemed like a good idea. Our story drifts back thousands of years, far from modern cities and smoky cafes, into the thick jungles and sun-washed plains of the Americas, where some of the earliest known smoke enthusiasts were gently toasting and inhaling plant matter long before the word nicotine entered the chat. The Mayans, with their impressive calendars and penchant for building step pyramids that double as giant staircases for the brave or foolish, were among the earliest known smokers. They didn't call them cigarettes, of course, because they hadn't accidentally invented France yet. Instead, these ancient smokers used ritual pipes to burn tobacco and other herbs for spiritual purposes, because naturally, nothing says divine insight like a room full of very fragrant smoke and a pensive look. To smoke in those days was not an idle pastime. It wasn't what you did on break at the medieval scroll-casting consultancy. It was sacred, part medicine, part magic, part extremely confusing dream sequence. Tobacco was often mixed with other herbs or even hallucinogens, which, in hindsight, may explain why their temples have all those jaguar motifs and staircases that say, "Don't run, or you will fall into the afterlife." As we drift softly along the jungle canopy of history, we eventually float past the Mayans and swirl into other indigenous cultures across North and South America. Each had their own version of smoking, ceremonial, healing, and social. There were peace pipes, prayer smokes, and yes, a few folks who frankly just enjoyed the soothing puff of a rolled-up leaf after a long day of not being conquered yet. And then, one breezy morning in 1492, a tall Italian fellow, wearing questionable leggings and historical entitlement, stepped off a creaking ship. Columbus, which is a name that now mostly makes people wince in discomfort. When he and his tremendously lost crew arrived in the Caribbean, they noted with mild fascination and total future exploitation that the local people rolled dried tobacco leaves and set them aflame to inhale the smoke. To them, it wasn't so much a habit as a spiritual technology. To Columbus's crew, it looked like a weekend hobby with exciting import potential. Soon after, tobacco seeds hitched a ride back across the Atlantic, tucked into the coat pockets of sailors who were very proud of having discovered something that could be lit on fire and inhaled without immediate death. This was a groundbreaking concept for Europeans, who were mostly still trying to figure out if tomatoes were safe to eat and which herbs could cure gout. Spoiler, none of them. By the late 16th century, Smoking had wafted across European society like an unasked-for party guest who brings their own fog machine. In Spain and Portugal, it took root quickly. The English, eager not to be outdone in their imperial aspirations or their cough-inducing experiments, followed suit. Sir Walter Raleigh, Elizabethan explorer and part-time romantic, famously introduced tobacco to the English court, probably with some dramatic flourish and a puff that said, "Yes, I do smell slightly on fire, and yes, I am deeply poetic." Queen Elizabeth I, who had little patience for nonsense, may or may not have cracked a smile. Now, these early puffs of historical smoke didn't quite resemble the sleek, mass-produced cigarettes of today. Back then, folks used pipes, cigars, and curious rolled-up leaf bundles that resemble something between a burrito and an art project. And smoking wasn't terribly convenient. You had to light it from a candle or from the genuinely terrifying open flame in your fireplace. No wonder people kept catching their wigs on fire. Still, by the early 1600s, tobacco was the cash crop that underpinned colonies, funded wars, and filled the pockets of people who primarily wore tights as formal wear. It was considered a cure for aches, bad breath, and even the plague, which really makes you wonder how bad some medieval breath must have been. But most of all, it was fashionable, a little spicy, a little smoky, and slightly dangerous, just like the corsets of the time. As tobacco began to dominate global trade routes, transform European leisure habits, and fuel some very niche perfume choices, a quiet but crucial transformation was already stirring. The humble leaf, once wrapped and puffed by shamans in the forest, was about to become something else entirely. Something wrapped in paper, sold by the carton, and flicked from the fingers of poets and poker players alike. But for now, rest easy with the sweet tendrils of ancient smoke curling around the memory of forgotten rituals, and listen closely, because our next dreamy detour takes us into the curious birth of the mass-produced cigarette and the bafflingly large mustaches of Victorian marketers. Ah, tobacco, the leaf that launched 1,000 sighs and at least as many questionable life choices. In our last little twirl through time, we brushed up against the curious origins of smoking. But tonight, or this curious hour when time seems to be lounging in its pajamas, let's float a little further down the fragrant wisp of history to see what happened when tobacco first hit a very specific milestone, when somebody thought to roll it up, stick it between their lips, and confidently declare, "Yes, this is quite fine indeed." It's hard to say exactly who looked at loose tobacco, then at a scrap of paper, then back at the tobacco again, and said, I shall make this portable. But humans, ever the inventive creatures, have a knack for turning everything into something more convenient, whether that's fire on a stick or anxiety in an inbox. Now, before the cigarette came puffing down the cobbled streets of Europe, people had already been smoking tobacco in various ways for centuries. Long pipes, short pipes, pipes that looked vaguely threatening, cigar-like rolls, and even those ancient smudging rituals that, quite frankly, smelled better than most yoga studios today. The indigenous peoples of the Americas had been intimately familiar with tobacco long before the rest of the world caught the scent. They smoked it in ceremonial pipes, long, slender instruments carved with such reverence they could double as museum pieces today, or very dramatic hatpins. These ritual smokes weren't recreational in the way we might picture a 1950s noir detective, brooding in a corner with a cigarette and unresolved emotional baggage. Instead, tobacco was spiritual, a conduit to dialoguing with the divine, or at the very least, the weather. But By the 1500s, European explorers had enthusiastically picked up the smoking habit and dropped it across the continent like dandelion seeds in a breeze. At first, they smoked it the way they'd seen it smoked. Pipes and primitive cigar shapes that look more like burritos rolled by someone in a hurry. Yet, it didn't take long before European ingenuity, or perhaps boredom, decided to mix things up. Swapping out traditional pipes for little rolled bundles, the Spanish are often credited with early versions of the cigarette. In the port city of Seville, sometime in the 17th century, tobacco scraps left over from cigars were collected by thrifty folk who couldn't afford the full-fat luxury of a whole cigar. These scraps were wrapped in bits of newspaper or paper pulp, twisted at one end and lit at the other. Essentially, the duct tape version of a cigar. A bit crispy, a bit desperate, but effective. Soon this practice grew from the fringes into a bit of a fad, at least among those who didn't mind inky lips or the occasional accidental editorial in their lungs. By the 1800s, especially with the Industrial Revolution fussing about and making everything busier and bolder, the cigarette began to find itself fast-tracked. Factories churned, papers rolled, and suddenly smoking was no longer an artistic, meditative experience. It was quick, convenient, and infused with the irresistible allure of doing something mildly dangerous very frequently. In France, cigarettes began to blossom into their own culture. Toward the mid-19th century, the French army actually encouraged their soldiers to smoke cigarettes because pipes were too fragile for battlefield conditions. Nothing says military innovation quite like replacing sabers with smokes. Meanwhile, over in England, an interesting twist of accidental import won over the British heart. During the Crimean War, British soldiers observed Turkish troops smoking these slim little rolled cigarettes and brought the habit home like a pack of exotic pastries. Only these ones smelled of rebellion and the decline of lung function, and thus began the dawn of the manufactured cigarette. Speed and style met at a crossroads when, in 1880, James Albert Bonsack, a name that, if you say it quickly, sounds like a sneeze, invented the first reliable cigarette rolling machine. This single contraption could produce about 200 cigarettes per minute, roughly the same number needed to film a single scene in a noir film. Cigarettes became everywhere, almost overnight. Sophistication was sold in slim packages. An entire industry bloomed, not with petals, but with smoke rings and slogans convinced you of distinction, daring, and just a dash of adulthood. But as we settle more deeply into our pillows and drift into the trails of history's haze, we can't help but wonder, how did this smoky little roll become such a powerhouse? Which clever voices began to fan the flames of its popularity, selling dreams along with every puff? Perhaps, as the night gently exhales, we'll let those whispers carry us to the smooth-talking world of early cigarette advertising, where truth was often optional, but style was guaranteed. As the dusk of the 16th century settled over Europe, a peculiar new habit was starting to curl its way into courtly parlours and philosopher dens. A habit that arrived packed in wooden crates, wrapped in legend, and smelled, not entirely unlike a bonfire after a particularly enthusiastic forest party. This, dear listener, was tobacco, the leaf that would become the centerpiece of one of history's strangest bonding rituals. Let us drift, if you will, to a time when Queen Elizabeth I ruled with ruffled collars and steady hands, and Sir Walter Raleigh was busy introducing not just potatoes to English gardens, but also curling columns of smoke. It's often said Raleigh brought tobacco from the New World to the keenly curious noses of England's elite, though history, in its usual murky fashion, likes to argue about the details. Raleigh, ever the showman, reportedly smoked a pipe in front of his stunned servants. One of them allegedly, and rather dramatically, thought he was on fire and flung a bucket of water on him. Whether or not this story is true, which it probably isn't, one must admit it paints an appealing picture of early tobacco confusion. Smoking, back then, gave the impression less of cool rebellion and more of spontaneous combustion. But rewind a bit further, across oceans and jungles, to where tobacco had a much older resume. Indigenous peoples of the Americas had been cultivating and using tobacco for centuries before European ships wandered their way. For them, this wasn't a leisure time puff-puff pastime. Tobacco had spiritual significance. It was used in rituals, for medicinal purposes, and possibly, as many claim, to commune with celestial beings, or at the very least, impress them with a mystical haze. The pipe was the instrument of choice in these rituals, beautifully carved, adorned, and handled with the kind of reverence one might reserve for a wise old owl or a particularly charismatic shaman. The idea of lighting dried leaves and sending their spirits skyward held symbolic weight, far weightier than the idle flick of a modern lighter. When Europeans got their hands on tobacco, however, they did what they often did with foreign plants: smoked them vigorously, commercialized them instantly, and misunderstood them wildly. Back in Europe, people were not content with mere ritual. No, they needed the process to be very important and entirely fashionable. Enter Jean Nicot, French ambassador to Portugal, who sent powdered tobacco to the Queen Mother of France as a medicine for her migraines. It's from him we get the word nicotine, a fact that should haunt his legacy, but instead sounds strangely dapper. At this point, tobacco was being sniffed as snuff, chewed like a root with secrets, and sipped in smoke. Form, as versatile and trendy as a modern superfood smoothie. One day it's snuff for aristocrats, the next, it's being smoked in taverns more enthusiastically than awkward small talk. The act of smoking itself had begun to evolve too. While pipes were dominant in these early days, they came with drawbacks. For one, pipes had the unfortunate habit of making people look like they were concentrating too hard on their own thoughts, or trying to whistle inward. They also required paraphernalia, tampers and pokers and matches, and ideally, a nearby fireproof establishment. No one had quite figured out the crisp convenience of the rolled cigarette just yet. That innovation, like most things that become far too popular, was still lingering somewhere in the wings. Still, smoking began to spread not just as habit, but as spectacle. Monarchs issued decrees about it. Some forbade it, some adored it. King James I despised tobacco and even penned an entire essay, charmingly titled A Counterblast to Tobacco, where he called smoking a custom loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, and much less flavorfully, dangerous to the lungs. One might imagine him wagging a disapproving royal finger while someone hotboxed the hallway behind him. His disdain, however, didn't stop anyone. In fact, as with most prohibitions throughout history, it did little more than give the activity a dash of forbidden allure. The more smoke people were told to avoid, the more they seemed to wade into it with gusto. Tobacco became currency and vice, medicine and menace. Sailors chewed it, clergy debated it, artists romanticized it. Nobody was quite sure what it was, but they were absolutely certain that everybody else was doing it, which is, historically speaking, how most bad habits go viral. And so, with the world exhaling in unison, some skeptically, some stylishly, we tiptoe onward past the pipes and powdered snuff, toward the slow, papery invention that would soon begin curling its way into pockets, parlor rooms, and history books alike. In the quiet hills of 16th century Europe, where goats roamed freer than most ideas and people still debated whether tomatoes were secretly poisonous, a strange, vaporous habit began floating in from across the sea. That's right, tobacco, that peculiar leaf with a flair for drama and addiction, had finally arrived to clutter European air and confuse their senses. Back then, Europe was not quite the smoking lounge it would become. In fact, most gatherings were more concerned with chastity, cheese-making, and elaborate neck ruffs than with puffing on exotic greenery. Smoking a leaf sounded like something only a deranged apothecary or a very bored witch might do. The transformation began with returning explorers, particularly the ones who couldn't leave well enough alone. Imagine you've just landed in the Caribbean. You've been at sea for weeks. Your only meals have been hardtack and mild despair. And suddenly, you see locals peacefully puffing on rolled tobacco leaves. Naturally, you assume one of two things. Either they've unlocked ancient wisdom, or they're on fire. Rodrigo de Jerez, a Spanish explorer with the curiosity of a child and the mustache of a man who thought he knew everything, was one such fellow. He observed indigenous peoples of the Americas calmly exhaling smoke through their nostrils, and rather than dropping his rations and fleeing, Rodrigo thought, "Yes, I shall try this mysterious mist," and so began his ill-fated journey into smokiness. When he returned to Spain, proudly drawing on a hand-rolled cigar, his neighbors saw the smoke pouring from his face and did what any reasonable person would do when faced with an unexplained human-shaped chimney. They called the Inquisition. Rodrigo was reportedly jailed for his smoky hobbies, because naturally, puffing leaves was clearly the devil's pastime. Still, curiosity is contagious, even more so than smoke rings. Tobacco began wafting between aristocratic parlors and back alley experimenters. Soon, it wasn't just for the daring or the imprisoned. Doctors, bless their medieval hearts, began recommending it for everything from halitosis to hysteria. If your head ached or your humors felt unbalanced, perhaps you simply hadn't inhaled the right breakfast. As Europe's love affair with tobacco bloomed, the form of its consumption evolved too. Pipes became poetry. Snuff was a dainty performance. But none captured the imagination quite like the cigarette. Dainty, portable, and completely lacking in judgment. However, it's important to note, the cigarette, as we know it, had not yet swaggered into the party. In the 16th and 17th centuries, smoking was primarily a bulky business. Pipes and cigars ruled the scene. Cigarettes were like the beta version of a badly coded app, still clunky, mostly ignored. But that didn't stop some clever thinkers from rolling their own mini-smokes. Spanish beggars are said to have gathered the stubs of wealthy smokers' cigars, a practice they called papelitos, which sounds suspiciously like a nickname for a mischievous pet. These scraps were bundled into paper to make something halfway between practicality and desperation. Smoking was, in essence, being crowdsourced. Innovation, after all, often begins with the people who collect your leftovers. Of course, the wealthy were appalled. Papelitos, they sniffed, were undignified, unsanitary, and smelled like humility. Cigars, on the other hand, smelled like wood-paneled libraries and colonial overreach. As with many social customs, the divide between the posh and the practical was as thick as pre-industrial smog. Still, these humble paper-wrapped scraps carried a certain charm. And as time meandered forward, as factories churned and machines began making things faster than a human could sneeze, the art of hand-rolling gradually became a slick, industrial endeavor. But that, sweet dreamer, is a story best whispered through swirls of factory steam and the clinking rhythm of gears. For now, picture Rodrigo de Jerez exhaling proudly into the crisp Spanish air, oblivious to the panic he would cause. A man who ignited both a trend and several jurisdictional concerns. He gives a little cough, pats his ruffled collar, and utters the clearly unwise words, "What could possibly go wrong?" And as the smoke drifts skyward, we too drift gently, floating toward the lands where factories hum and governments squint suspiciously at all things wrapped in paper. In the softly curling mist of the 17th century, tobacco had made itself thoroughly at home across the pockets of polite society in Europe. After its smoky voyage from the New World, it wasted no time setting up shop, figuratively and quite literally, in taverns, coffee houses, and the specially crafted smoking rooms of well-heeled aristocrats. And while today we might envision crowded, jazz-filled rooms from the 1920s when we hear the word smoke, the reality centuries earlier was, shall we say, less chic and more chimney sweep. In London, the capital of fog and flare, it wasn't uncommon to see gentlemen with exaggeratedly large pipes practically dragging behind them. The longer the stem, the cooler the smoke. Not metaphorically, mind you, but physically. It was a practical affectation. By the time the smoke reached your lips through an arm's-length pipe, it had cooled substantially. This allowed the smoker to enjoy their tobacco with less of the fiery intensity and more of the contemplative haze. Mind you, not everyone was thrilled about this new leafy indulgence. King James I of England, an early anti-smoking pioneer, or perhaps we should say an early grumbler-in-chief, was so displeased by the trend that he authored a snort-worthy pamphlet in 1604 called A Counterblast to Tobacco. In it, he referred to smoking rather dramatically as loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, dangerous to the lungs. Quite the Yelp review. Despite his regal disapproval, King James's scathing words did very little to quell the smoky enthusiasm. In fact, they may have done the opposite, as rebellious nobles, always partial to thumbing their powdered noses at the monarchy, seemed to puff all the harder. After all, nothing makes something more appealing than being told you absolutely shouldn't do it. Human nature irresistibly contrary since time immemorial. Meanwhile, across the Channel in France, tobacco had been enjoying a far more poetic reception. It had been introduced earlier in the century by Jean Nicot, a name that might sound suspiciously familiar. Yes, dear dreamer, the substance many came to crave bears the name of the very man who shipped it to royalty, nicotine, a rather unintended but enduring legacy. Jean Nicot sent snuff, a pulverized form of tobacco, to the French court to treat the Queen's migraines. And from that medicinal gesture grew an entire culture of nose-focused habit. Snuff became fashionable, particularly among the nobility. There's something oddly amusing about sophisticated courtiers delicately tipping a pinch of dry tobacco powder into their nostrils between flirtations and fan flutterings. They called it taking a pinch, and it was all the rage. Quick, stylish, and with the added benefit of not having to wash smoke out of your wigs. Tobacco use spread quickly across all levels of society. Sailors chewed it to pass the time on long voyages. Soldiers smoked it as comfort between battles. Actors nibbled on snuff backstage before swaggering into soliloquies. Even bishops quietly partook during long synods, though one presumes in the more dignified indoor ways. But what's worth noting is that none of this was quite yet the cigarette, as we now know it. It was mostly pipes, chewing, or snuffing. Rolling tobacco into little paper tubes. That hadn't caught on yet. That development was still smouldering on the horizon. not yet quite lit. Of course, with great popularity came inventiveness. In the early 1600s, smoke rings became a thing, a performative habit, like doing tricks at a tavern for applause and perhaps another round. Blowing smoke shapes was considered flirtatious, especially if directed at someone across the table. In other words, smoky courtship was born, with its foggy promises and its not-so-subtle hints. The smell of tobacco, whether rich or acrid, became part of the daily air. It mingled with the scent of roast game, tallow candles, and occasionally horse. It was a world in which every room had a haze and every conversation a smoky edge. And yet, through this fog of fashion and resistance, we still hadn't quite reached the age of mass production, of factory-rolled cigarettes tucked into pocket tins and advertised with impossible promises. That, my dear listener, lingered just ahead, waiting patiently in the gentle glow of the industrial age's dawn. But before we light that match, we must drift a moment longer through the powdered courts and pipe-filled parlours of early Europe, where tobacco was both a scandal and a sensation. Let's linger there just a bit more in the next quiet moment. Smoke, as it turns out, has forever held a certain mysterious enchantment over humanity, dancing in the air with all the confidence of a ghost on holiday. But before filtered cigarettes, before elegant European cigarette holders, before even the word cigarette wafted into the lexicon like a puff of polite rebellion, humans were already enchanted by lighting things on fire and inhaling them. Now, we journey to the 15th and 16th centuries, when European explorers were busy discovering places that, inconveniently for their maps, were already well discovered by the people living there. In the Caribbean, particularly among the Taino people, these travelers witnessed a peculiar custom. The locals would roll dried tobacco leaves, light one end, and breathe in the smoke from the other. To the Europeans, who already believed spices could cure gout and that bathing might give you a cold, well, this smoking business seemed positively magical. Enter Rodrigo de Jerez, the man history forgets, but whose lungs never could. A member of Columbus's second voyage, Rodrigo puffed along with the locals, promptly developed a fondness for the leafy pastime, and brought the habit home to Spain, which might have gone better for him had he not paraded down his village streets exhaling clouds like a sentient chimney. For this display, his neighbours did the reasonable 16th century thing. They accused him of witchcraft. Rodrigo was tossed into a dungeon by the Spanish Inquisition because, quote, only the devil could give a man the power to breathe smoke from his nose. One can only imagine his cellmates asking what sorcery he had conjured and offering a trade for it. While Rodrigo contemplated the perils of international hobbies, tobacco was gaining a smoky foothold all across Europe. Nobles began to puff. Doctors began to prescribe. Yes, doctors, blissfully unaware of future surgeon generals, thought tobacco could do everything from curing bad breath to warding off the plague. If you were coughing, they'd hand you a pipe. If you weren't coughing, they'd give you two. Now, let's take a gentle shuffle into the 17th century, an era of tall wigs, elaborate manners, and so much puffing that entire rooms would resemble Victorian steam engines at rest. Initially, though, tobacco was smoked in long pipes, some so massive you'd need the lung capacity of a cathedral organ to operate them. But cumbersome as they were, pipes remained the accessory of choice, especially popular among Dutch merchants and English sea captains, who could glare meaningfully through coils of smoke. But then, we must whisper this dramatically, paper met tobacco. It wasn't love at first sniff, but it was convenience that drew them together. Somewhere in Spain, Around the early 1800s, poor folks got clever. Lacking pipes, which were either expensive or cheerfully stolen, they began rolling leftover tobacco in scraps of newspaper. Thus, the hand-rolled cigarette was born, flimsy, sooty, and apparently readable if you squinted. And Europe took notice. Soon, production started to evolve. In Seville, small factories sprang up, dedicated almost entirely to rolling cigarettes by hand. These factories were famously staffed by women, known as the cigarreras, who were paid not only poorly, but often in tobacco itself. They were fiery, independent, and said to influence fashion more than the royal court did. Some even became local celebrities, strutting through markets with tobacco-stained fingers and scarves tied like queens of organized mischief. Little by little, what began as a practical solution for those without pipes became a fashion. By the late 19th century, cigarettes had made their way through every social class, leaving a curling trail of smoke and questionable health theories behind them. And just as the cigarette began to make its paper-wrapped ascent, the industrial world was preparing to do what it did best: mass-produce the heck out of everything. Machines were designed, factories rumbled awake, and soon cigarettes were arriving in neat little boxes bearing logos, promises, and someday, warnings. But that's still a breath away. Let us pause here, watching gentle wisps of history drift by, as if the past itself is sighing. The century is young, the factories are humming, and the stage is set for characters stranger even than smoke itself. Centuries before the sterile glow of cigarette vending machines and the mysterious allure of health-warning labels, humans were already experts at setting things on fire and inhaling the consequences. For reasons varying from the ritualistic to the outright ridiculous, people have long been drawn to smoke. Not the fire, just the fashionable fumes. By the 16th century, after Columbus had unintentionally introduced Europe to a continent previously unaware of smallpox and soup spoons, tobacco had wafted its way from the New World into the salons and back alleys of the Old. Spanish and Portuguese explorers, dazzled by the unfamiliar custom of the Caribbean Taino people inhaling dried leaves through their noses and mouths, returned with tales of medicinal smoke and magical plants. Of course, they also brought actual tobacco, because nothing spreads faster than a potentially addictive export. Imagine a velvet-draped chamber in Elizabethan England. The air is thick, technically with humidity, but soon with something far more pungent. Sir Walter Raleigh, resplendent in ruff and reputation, is unironically considered the man who popularized tobacco smoking in the English court. There he stands, calmly puffing on a long clay pipe, looking like the sort of chap who enjoys transcontinental adventures and fiddly collars. Queen Elizabeth herself, though not a smoker, was known to appreciate courtly innovation. But not everyone was charmed. In one particularly apocryphal tale, Raleigh's own servant, upon seeing him exhaling smoke, believed he was on fire and heroically doused him with ale. Whether this happened or not is beside the point. The mental image is delightful. A man in tights rescuing another man in tights by throwing beer on him. Classic Tudor firefighting. Tobacco's appeal was undeniable, and Europe took to it with astonishing enthusiasm. Pipes, cigars, snuff, all the many ways to ingest fine-ground leaves without actually eating them, became fashionable among the well-to-do, and even the vaguely to-do. But cigarettes? Those slim, rebellious gadgets of smoky rebellion were still forming their identity. The very earliest forms of something resembling a cigarette can be traced back to the Aztecs and Mayans, who, for both ceremonial uses and recreational puffing, would roll tobacco and other herbs in palm or maize leaves. These weren't cigarettes, as we know them, of course. More like artisanal leaf burritos filled with psychoactive plants and belief in the gods. Yet the cigarette, in its modern, filter-tipped, easily pocketable form, didn't truly emerge until the 19th century, notably in Spain. The Spanish word cigarrito means little cigar. And let's be honest, that perfectly captures the energy of someone who wants to seem sophisticated, without fully committing to the smoky opera-length commitment of a big boy cigar. By the 1840s, the habit had trickled into France, that bastion of romance and revolutionary spirit, where cigarettes became known for their devil-may-care elegance. Every Parisian artist worth their beret and existential dread was soon depicted with a cigarette dangling not just from their lips, but from their very sense of purpose. The poet was no longer complete without ink-stained fingers, a half-finished stanza, and a feathery plume of tobacco smoke curling eloquently toward the ceiling. But where art and philosophy lead, industry soon follows. Enter the cigarette-making machine. Invented in the 1880s by a clever American named James Bonsack, whose last name sounds suspiciously like something out of a Dickens novel. The machine could roll around 120,000 cigarettes a day. Humans, by comparison, were tragically inefficient, managing only a few hundred and dozens of paper cuts. With mechanization, the cigarette transformed from an artisan's distraction to a mass-market marvel. And so, the stage was set for cigarettes to evolve from a smoky curiosity into a full-blown cultural phenomenon. Once advertising, Hollywood, and a general disregard for lung function got involved, of course. But before that flurry of filtered frenzy, let's drift gently into the hazier side of history, where we find ourselves in Ottoman coffee houses and the seductive swirl of smoke in slippers and silks. As we drift gently into the foggy past, let us momentarily pause at a peculiar, fragrant junction in human history. The moment when smoking went from something done ceremonially or medicinally to something done because, well, everyone else was doing it, and it made you look ever so slightly mysterious, possibly French. By the late 1800s, Europe and America had entered what one might call the golden age of puffery. Though pipe smoking had been the classy thing to do for centuries, and snuff was the powdered nose party people swore by, the humble cigarette was about to throw them all a sideways glance and sashay past in a cloud of fashionable smoke. You see, before cigarettes were cranked out of mysterious vending machines or tossed glamorously from convertible windows in black and white films, they were mostly hand-rolled, artisanal affairs. Artisanal, in this case, meaning you sat down with some rolling papers, spilled tobacco all over your lap, and spent the better part of an hour making something that looked like it had been attacked by a raccoon. But in 1880, everything changed. The year the Baxter of Beelzebub came to life. That is to say, the Bonsack machine was born. Invented by a man named James Bonsack, it was the first automated cigarette rolling contraption, capable of spitting out 200 cigarettes per minute, which was approximately 200 more than the human average without weeping. It revolutionized tobacco production, and soon cigarette companies were rolling in both literal tobacco and metaphorical money. Chief among them, the American Tobacco Company, headed by a man named James Buchanan Duke, a name that sounds like the villain from a Southern Gothic novel, but mostly specialized in capitalism and making absolutely everything smell faintly of nicotine. Thanks to their industrial wizardry and relentless advertising, some of which featured doctors assuring everyone cigarettes were good for you. Oh yes, we'll get there eventually. cigarettes quickly leapt from aristocratic accessory to working-class companion. They became the first truly mass-consumed smoke. Paper-wrapped democracies, one and all. And yet, at this curious turning point, there existed what I can only describe as cigarette culture. A whole lifestyle bundled up with the act of lighting up. Think smoky jazz clubs, long gloves, and that distinct sound of a match striking in the dark just before someone says something dramatic like, "He never left the train station." Cigarettes became props in the theatre of modern life, no longer purely ceremonial or medicinal, unless you count drama as medicine, which some of us most certainly do. But it wasn't just in the West. Over in the Ottoman Empire, cigarettes had been popular for over a century already. There too, they had shifted from nargile, water-piped elegance, to quick, paper-rolled convenience. By the early 20th century, the whole globe had started to follow the curl of smoke, trailed by men in fedoras and women with dangerous cheekbones. It became a modern ritual, this smoking thing. Not quite spiritual, no longer medicinal, but something habitual, something social. Shared matches, shared silences on balconies, shared excuses to step away from awkward dinner parties. The cigarette became a tiny torch of rebellion or chic detachment, depending on the angle of the lean and the arch of the brow. There were even etiquette guides about smoking. Yes, Emily Post, that high priestess of polite behavior, addressed the act of lighting up in public. Don't puff too vigorously. Don't ash on your hostess's rug. Don't forget to offer one to your companion, particularly if they're frowning at your outrageous coughing fit. And while millions took up the habit, very few stopped to wonder when, exactly, smoking had stepped off the stage of ceremony and landed neatly into the pocket of every trench coat and clutch purse. Still, as the bond sacks, word-on and advertisements promised vitality, sophistication, and an uncanny ability to make trench coats look sultry. The cigarette had found its place. It had walked through the door marked modern life and left an ashtray on the credenza. Soon enough, other innovations and a few scandalous scientific discoveries would begin to complicate this smoky love story. But we shall get there in time. For now, let the whiff of tobacco-scented history linger faintly as we turn down the volume on the coughing chorus of modernity and drift onward toward the next curious corner of the cigarette's winding tale. On a foggy evening in 17th century Paris, while the moonlight crept shyly behind chimney tops and gossip curled through alleyways like perfume, an elegant aristocrat named Madame Devolay stood upon her wide stone balcony overlooking the Seine. She wore an impossibly feathered hat and held between her gloved fingers what many Parisians still called a Spanish sin stick. This was, of course, a cigarette, or something sort of like one. Still distant cousins, perhaps, to its modern siblings, thinner, trickier, and prone to disintegrating in the rain. The 1600s in Europe were a theatrical time for anything involving smoke. Tobacco, that recently imported intrigue from the New World, was not just a habit. It was a symbol of wealth, of worldliness, of a person who had very important thoughts while exhaling dramatically. And the Europeans, quite recently, had decided that smoking made you interesting, preferably in silhouette. But let's rewind for a gentle moment. While cigarettes, as we know them, were still percolating in society's subconscious, tobacco itself was spreading like wildfire, sometimes literally. In England, gentlemen strolled about with clay pipes clenched in their teeth, looking very philosophical, even when they were mostly wondering what was for supper. In Spain and Portugal, smoking wasn't confined to pipes. people had started rolling tobacco in maize or paper, creating the earliest, humble versions of cigarettes. Picture something that looked a bit less James Dean and a bit more like a crinkly torch about to fall apart. These pre-modern cigarettes were often homemade and quite adventurous. One might be wrapped in pages torn hastily from a religious tract or the back of a list of sins to confess. Resourceful, if a bit flammable. In the Ottoman Empire, however, smoking had become an entire social ritual. Cafes buzzed with conversations, puffed cloaks of scented smoke hung in the air, and men with artfully curled mustaches balanced Nargile pipes with such finesse that you might mistake them for performing a slow ballet. Tobacco in these circles was less about vice and more about performance art. A puff, a pause, a philosophical quip about the stars, and then a puff again. It was in the folds of these various cultures that something magical and noticeably French began to occur. By the early 18th century, Parisians had taken the act of smoking and elevated it to sophisticated drama. Smoking became part of the intellectual toolkit. You had books, you had spectacles, and you had a rolled cigarette perched just so, as you pondered your next clever observation about Rousseau, or how very late it was getting. Back at her balcony, Madame Devolay delicately tapped ash onto a silver tray shaped like a sleeping cherub. She did not inhale the smoke so much as wear it, and the burning tobacco on her lip was no less a fashion statement than the ostrich feather pointing vaguely eastward from her hat. Around her, the city yawned and blinked slowly into darkness. Horse hooves echoed on cobblestones, slippers shuffled across salons, and somewhere in a garret window a poet failed dramatically to rhyme something with spleen. Of course, cigarettes wouldn't be mass-produced for another century. These early ones were fiddly, handmade, irregular in shape and spirit, but they were already spreading delight, or at least occupying people's hands while they waited for inspiration to strike. That said, not everyone was enchanted. Some clergy called tobacco the devil's incense, which frankly gives it more theatrical appeal. One particular preacher in Germany declared that smoke was visible proof of sin, leaving the human body, which possibly made him history's first ever metaphorical personal trainer. Meanwhile, across the seas in the Americas, indigenous communities were entirely baffled by Europe's newfound obsession. For them, tobacco had long been a sacred plant, used sparingly in rituals and ceremonies. Watching Europeans roll it up in pieces of newspaper and spark it like an impulsive teenager was like watching someone use an ancient gospel text to wrap fish. Spiritually unsettling and oddly fishy. Yet humans, despite our best efforts to be sensible, enjoy routine, comfort, and small embers of drama. Smoking fulfilled all of these, and cigarettes, those slender fuses, would soon find their place in every port, every parlour, every poet's coat pocket. But while they were still meandering through courtly hands and smoky cafes, the world slowly adjusted to the idea of tobacco not as a sacred ritual, but as part of the scenery. A whispery little habit, half angel, half devil, depending on who was watching you smoke and how attractively the light hit your cheekbones. And now, with a faint curl of smoke trailing into the nighttime breeze, we drift ever onward, toward distant factories and strange machines and the excellent mischief of modern industry. As dusk settles over the cobblestone avenues of 18th century Europe, the silhouette of a man in a powdered wig drifts through the smoky air. The faint scent of tobacco is wrapped delicately in notes of bergamot cologne, horses, and the faint desperation of the Enlightenment. Our mysterious gentleman, whom we'll call Claude because everyone needs a Claude, is heading to his club, a comfortable, velvet-chaired establishment where men sip warmed brandy, discuss Voltaire, and most of all, smoke with dramatic flair. Now, smoking in this age wasn't merely a habit, it was a bit of an operatic performance. Pipes were the reigning monarchs of this ritual, a tradition passed down through empires and grandfathers alike. Picture Claude, possibly with his pinky extended, striking a flint with all the gravity of planning a small revolutionary war. He carefully lights a pipe the size of a cucumber and proceeds to exhale a smoke ring. Impressive enough to earn applause from a nearby hedgehog. But wait, where are the cigarettes? Ah, yes, not yet. You see, despite tobacco having spread across Europe like spilled ink across parchment since the 16th century, the cigarette remained an underwhelming footnote, a rustic cousin compared to the elaborate pipe or the fashionable snuff box that made you sneeze so elegantly it could earn you an invitation to Versailles. Those who did roll tobacco in paper were often, well, peasants or soldiers. Not to be unkind, but in the 1700s, cigarettes were barely a thing. A little bit of shag tobacco twisted in some newspaper and lit with the candle at your barrack. Less a luxurious indulgence, more a desperate Wednesday. Yet oddly enough, it was war that finally shoved cigarettes into polite society's waistcoat pocket. You see, wars are strange incubators of trends. For example, trench coats, wristwatches, and unfortunate poetry. Fast forward with me now to the 19th century, where war once again plays matchmaker between soldiers and convenience. During various military campaigns, especially in the Crimean War of the 1850s, British soldiers found themselves fighting alongside the Ottomans and discovered Turkish soldiers cheerfully puffing away on hand-rolled paper smokes. The British raised one collective eyebrow, tried it, and presumably said something sophisticated like, "Jolly good." And voila, the cigarette begins its reluctant rise. Soldiers returning from battle brought the habit back home where, for the first time, a rolled tobacco stick started seeming less like a peasant's necessity and more like a practical alternative to carting around a pipe the size of a fireplace poker. Still, it took technology and a dash of capitalist chutzpah to truly light the fuse, so to speak. In 1880, a chap named James Bonsack, a man with a name that sounds like he belongs in a Dickens novel or a jar of pickled onions, patented a machine that could roll cigarettes faster than any human hand. Up until then, cigarettes had to be wrapped individually by workers, primarily women, who were seriously underpaid and possibly the unsung heroes of this history, if not for the whole spreading cancer thing. Bonsack's machine could spit out over 100,000 cigarettes a day. The American Tobacco Company, run by the infamous James Buck Duke, promptly leapt onto the idea like a Victorian child onto a Christmas plum pudding. Mass production began. The cigarette slowly but surely moved from being a novelty to being, well, everywhere. And here's the twist, pun intended, not everyone liked it. Cigar lovers turned their noses up at cigarettes, calling them coffin nails, an ironic nickname given well before health studies had their moment. Pipes were dignified, cigars were noble. But a paper roll filled with dry tobacco, that was, to many, the equivalent of drinking mead from a plastic cup, uncouth. Nonetheless, the convenience won the day. No cleaning, no fiddling with matches or embers or tiny pipe pluggers. Just strike, puff, toss. Smoking had entered the era of disposability, and with it, the era of compulsive puffing. It wouldn't be long before brands, advertising, and cunning slogans would transform this humble combusted leaf into a full-blown lifestyle. Wrist-flicking movie stars and trench-coated detectives were just around the corner. But for now, let Claude take another gracious puff in his velvet chair, unaware that his grandsons will one day walk down avenues in Paris and New York with smaller, tighter smokes between their fingers and far slicker hats. Soon, we find ourselves wafting into the golden age of cigarette glamour, just as smoky and illusionary as a magician's vanish trick. Picture, if you will, a candlelit salon in 18th century Paris, where powdered wigs ruled the day and philosophical discourse was the second most popular indoor activity. The first, of course, being coughing dramatically through clouds of tobacco smoke. By this point in history, smoking had evolved from sacred ceremony to statement piece, a kind of fashionable punctuation mark between one's thoughts, grievances, and unsolicited opinions about Rousseau. But somewhere outside the velvet-draped drawing rooms and the nervous scratching of quill pens on parchment, something curious was quietly taking shape. A shift, subtle at first, like the early clink of cutlery before a feast, was beginning to turn a broad, leafy plant into a tightly coiled, fiercely marketed stick of future addiction, the modern cigarette. The scene of this next transformation takes us not to a bustling city square, nor a regal court, but rather to the unsung heroes of our tale, soldiers. Those tirelessly marching men whose enduring gift to history was not just muddy socks and forgotten treaties, but also the popularization of tobacco rolled into tiny, manageable parcels. A practical development born not out of design but out of necessity. During the Napoleonic Wars, soldiers on the battlefield lacked the time, hands, or reliable weather conditions to maintain delicate pipes. The solution? Tear a page from whatever printed material was nearby, a newspaper, a love letter, or perhaps even an early draft of a bratty royal decree. Fill it with loose tobacco, twist the ends like a holiday peppermint, and voila, a humble cigarette. This DIY habit caught on, particularly among the French and Spanish troops. It also helps to know that Spaniards had already invented the papelito, a thin rolling paper made from rice or flax, originally intended for wrapping medicinal powders. It didn't take long before these papers teamed up with tobacco and formed a hasty alliance, a union that would revolutionize how humans could slowly, cheerfully damage their lungs. Still, in these early years, cigarettes remained the underdog of the smoking family. They were for peasants, prisoners, and poetry students, not proper gentlemen or wealthy dames who preferred their cigars as hefty as their bank accounts. In the genteel smoking hierarchy, cigarettes were the slightly embarrassing cousin who showed up at reunions wearing mismatched shoes and smelled faintly of ashtrays and anti-establishment sentiment. But then came the machines. Ah yes, the 1880s. A decade of bustles, beards and big ideas. Enter James Albert Bonsack, an American inventor who, in the proud tradition of accidental disruption, created a machine that could roll cigarettes at a rate of 200 per minute. Manual production at the time yielded just 4 per minute, so this was a quantum leap in laziness. With Bonsack's machine came mass production, and thanks to some impressively persuasive advertising. Imagine a Victorian PowerPoint presentation delivered via mustachioed carnival barker. Cigarettes began their meteoric rise. Suddenly, they were no longer the awkward backup dancers of smoking culture. They stepped center stage, offering affordable glamour in dainty, disposable form. The great industrial barons took notice, and so did their marketing departments. By the early 20th century, smoking wasn't simply a habit. It was a persona. There was the rugged cowboy type, the brooding intellectual type, and of course, the glamorous Hollywood ingenue who exhaled smoke as if sighing away a lifetime of mysterious heartbreak. All these archetypes, carefully curated and commodified, were built on a product initially rolled by someone bored in a foxhole with torn bits of parchment. But while the image shimmered in sepia-toned advertisements and silver screen kisses, the substance remained the same: shredded leaf, paper, and centuries of momentum. The humble cigarette, born from soldierly pragmatism and powered by the miracle of mechanization, had now traversed continents and crossed class lines. It was sold in vending machines, handed out in wartime rations, and glamorized in every conceivable setting except the doctor's office. Although, amusingly, some doctors too were featured in ads with a freshly lit cigarette in hand, recommending their brand of choice like a fine wine paired with just the right diagnosis. As we recline gently into the fabric of time, you might hear in the distance the beginnings of a new whisper. One where the gleam of golden tobacco begins to tarnish, ever so slightly, under the scrutiny of science and common sense. But for now, let the smoke swirl lazily in the air, mixing with dreams of paper-wrapped revolutions, softly drifting towards something new. Let us drift now to the 17th century, a time when wigs were extravagantly powdered, duels were fought over poorly phrased metaphors, and people still believed bathing was vaguely unwholesome. And yet, this is precisely when tobacco began to trickle across Europe, like an oddly smoky love letter from the New World. While royalty dabbled in perfumes and powdered noses, common folk and an increasing number of aristocrats were doing something far more rebellious: lighting up. Enter stage left, the pipe, a long, curly device that made its user look somewhere between a wizard and someone who reads poetry to their horse. Before cigarettes became the preferred dust devils of nicotiana consumption, the pipe was king. In taverns, drawing rooms, and under flickering candlelight, it was considered not just a habit, but a hobby. Smoking was a chance to look thoughtful, mysterious, or at least too preoccupied to notice someone spilled mutton stew on your breeches. Virginia tobacco, grown across the Atlantic by colonists who didn't entirely understand why they were there, became highly prized back in Europe. It wasn't just a leaf anymore. It was currency, status, and strangely enough, medicine. Yes, medicinal smoking. For headaches, stomach aches, melancholy, and uncomfortable silences at dinner. In fact, some doctors swore by it. Others simply swore. But as with all things popular in history, like arsenic wigs and bathing in mercury, enthusiasm outpaced wisdom. By the time the late 1600s rolled around, smoking had become something of a social dance. Picture a posh English salon, candles casting soft light on gilded mirrors, Lord Sniffington delicately lighting his pipe with a smouldering coal, elaborating on the virtues of ancient Rome while exhaling enough smoke to make the paintings weep. Across from him, Lady Tittlebottom fans herself dramatically, pretending the room isn't thick enough to cure a ham. But let's pause before this scene grows too ridiculous or cough-inducing. Because something quietly curious was happening far away from the velvet-draped parlours of London. In Spain, and later France, another innovation was rolling in, quite literally. Snuff, tobacco ground into a fine powder, inhaled sharply through the nose, was taking off as a trend among nobility. Though to the modern listener it may sound suspiciously unpleasant, snuff was considered the absolute peak of sophistication. It allowed for one to consume tobacco without the nuisance of open flame. Ideal for courtiers who spent most of their time either gossiping or delicately fainting. Still, many found the act of smoking far more contemplative than sneezing violently into someone's embroidery. So gradually, pipes evolved. They became more portable, more convenient, more everything. And, in some clever circles, especially those involving soldiers and on-the-go scallywags, people began to do something novel. They started rolling tobacco. Not quite cigarettes yet, mind you. These early roll-ups were rough, inconsistent, often wrapped in corn husks or whatever vaguely paper-like item was nearby. They were the microwavable noodle cup of the smoking world, cheap, fast, and not particularly elegant. And yet, something about them stuck. Enter the Spanish paper factories of the 18th century. In Seville, thin rolling papers were being produced by the pack, and lo, the proto-cigarette was born. It was called a papillate, a name which sounds delicate and gentle, like a butterfly napkin, but was in truth often clumsily assembled by bored soldiers stationed far from Seville's rolling mills. Somehow, despite this, perhaps because of this, the form persisted. It wasn't until much later that the cigarette, as we know it, began to take definitive shape. But these humble beginnings of scraps, papers, and experimental nose tickles paved the way for our modern little cylinder of vice. At this point in history, smoking wasn't just recreation. It was becoming infrastructure. Tobacco taxes brewed empires and funded enormous Baroque buildings that looked like marble wedding cakes. Smuggling it became a national sport. Smoking wasn't going away. It was becoming a ritual, a performance, a statement. And back in the cluttered coffee houses of Europe, philosophers gathered beneath clouds of blue haze, scribbling manifestos, debating atoms, and quietly wondering if anyone else could feel their eyebrows tingling. But that is a story wafting gently toward the kettle steam horizon. For now, let us exhale deeply and rest a while in the curling smoke of these early puff-filled centuries as we float gently toward the next chapter, where things begin to get far more factory-shaped and filtered. Wafting through the dusky air of 19th century salons and smoky cafes, the cigarette, once a humble twist of hand-rolled tobacco, had become quite the fashionable accessory. By this time, it wasn't just a way to puff away one's worries. It was an expression, a flair, a lightable punctuation mark in the life of a dashing European. Indeed, by the mid-1800s, cigarettes were shedding their rustic origins and beginning to flirt with mass appeal. The old world empires, particularly the Ottoman Empire in Spain, had long traditions of smoking tobacco in many forms. Hookahs, pipes, and those early proto-cigarettes rolled lovingly by hand, each one slightly different, like snowflakes with a nicotine habit. But little by little, cigar factories began to take notice of their slender little cousin, the cigarette. It was daintier, yes, but also quicker, more portable, ideal for moments when a 10-inch cigar would be, shall we say, a tad dramatic. By the 1840s and 1850s, cigarette consumption began increasing in parts of Europe, especially among soldiers and travelers. The Crimean War actually played an oddly pivotal role in this evolution. Not because anything about war is relaxing, but because those battling in the mud and chill discovered that tiny paper-wrap smokes were far more convenient than pipes on the battlefield. You can't exactly pack a bowl of fine Virginia leaf when you're dodging cannonballs. Now can you? English soldiers observed the Turkish troops deftly fashioning their own cigarettes. Little paper tubes of tobacco prepared with the finesse of a man rolling a micro-scroll of ancient wisdom. The British brought this crafty knowledge home with them, creating quite the ripple in the culture of combustible leisure. Soon enough, smoking was not only chic, it was also inclusively scandalous. Women, who had previously been restricted from puffing away in polite company, except perhaps while pretending the fireplace fumes had nothing to do with their mysteriously smoky breath, found in cigarettes a more socially acceptable vice. They could keep their cigarette cases in delicate handbags, drawn out only after dinner in luxurious salons, tapped gracefully with gloved fingers, and lit with silver lighters that gleamed like moonlight on marble. But back to the machinery of it all. As demand grew, hand-rolling every single cigarette proved time-consuming and costly, a productivity bottleneck that even the most nimble-fingered artisans couldn't solve. Enter James Albert Bonsack, a name that sounds like someone who spent his childhood being asked, "Do you prefer books or bonfires, Mr. Bonsack?" Who in 1880 developed a fully functional cigarette rolling machine. This wondrous contraption could roll cigarettes many times faster than human hands ever could, churning out up to 200 cigarettes per minute, or roughly enough to make an entire jazz band feel satisfied for the evening. This invention changed everything. Cigarettes became cheaper, more uniform, and startlingly abundant. Factories upriver and across oceans began spitting out stiff little sticks of tobacco with the mechanical enthusiasm of steam trains at tea time. And in walks American entrepreneur James Buchanan Duke, whose name sounds like he was born wearing a waistcoat. He fully embraced the Bonsack machine, slashing prices and transforming cigarettes into the snack food of the tobacco world, quick, easy, and dangerously addictive. Now, advertisements during this era began leaning hard into creativity. Cigarettes were marketed not just as products, but as portals to charisma. Posters depicted dashing men on horseback, poised with a cigarette and sculpted jawline, alongside slogans such as "mild as a May morning," as if one's lungs wouldn't soon be filing a protest. Women, too, were depicted with elegance and allure, cigarette in hand, and a world-weary knowing in their eyes, like they had just seduced an ambassador and weren't terribly impressed. Curiously, cigarettes even infiltrated political life. Some statesmen and diplomats favored them over cigars, as the shorter smoke break was more conducive to efficiently taking over small nations or reforming tax policies. In Russia, for example, cigarettes enjoyed widespread popularity, sometimes even used in barter during times of shortage. Imagine settling a dinner tab not with rubles, but with a generous flick of your cigarette case. Shall we call it 2 smokes and a match? So here we were, by the end of the 19th century, with the cigarette truly ascendant. It had gone from ragtag alley roll-up to high society fashion, from battlefield stress reliever to a reliable companion on late-night balconies across Europe and beyond. But of course, what goes up in smoke must at some point settle back to ash. In time, the culture of smoking would evolve yet again, shifting gears in surprising ways, involving Hollywood starlets, gritty noir detectives, and a whole lot of white lab coats conducting research they hoped no one would notice. But let's not light that match just yet. The night is stretching on, and history still has a few curls of smoke to reveal, one gentle puff at a time. As the moon drifts lazily across a velvet sky, let us meander now to the modish world of 18th century Europe, a gilded age of powdered wigs, clever scandals, and smoky salons where revolutions brewed in porcelain cups beside flickering candlelight. It was in this era, amid harpsichords, lace cuffs, and an abundance of decorative waistcoats, that tobacco began to evolve from simple pipe-faring leaf to something far more refined. One might even say fashionable. The aristocracy, ever in pursuit of novel ways to inhale dried plants, started to popularize an old new habit, snuff. Ah, snuff. To the modern ear, mere nasal inconvenience, but to the powdered aristocrat of 1761, sheer elegance. A finely ground tobacco powder meant to be sniffed, never snorted, one must remember, with great ceremony. Just a pinch between the fingers from a tiny silver case. A genteel nod of the head. Perhaps a sneeze if the blend was particularly spirited. But while noses were busy in drawing rooms, something curious was beginning to wind its lazy way into the wider populace, especially among the military, rowdy sailors, and eventually the average townsfolk. Rolled tobacco, smokable, portable, and entirely more satisfying when one simply didn't have time to pack a pipe mid-duel, or during a long day convincing people you were royal. French soldiers, particularly during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, were some of the earliest to adopt this new pragmatism. Tobacco, you see, was issued along with rations, a little reward for attempting to conquer Europe in tight trousers. And sometime in the thick of military necessity and Marlborough man inventiveness, some began to roll finely shredded tobacco in scraps of paper, often repurposing the pages of discarded books or orders they had no intention of following. Voila, the handmade cigarette. Now, this may conjure a certain image of scrappy soldiers hunched near campfires, puffing thoughtfully on Plato while preparing to pillage Prussia. And frankly, you wouldn't be far off. Literature and lung damage, all in a single breath. Meanwhile, back in the salons and coffee houses of the enlightened, the thought of inhaling smoke into one's chest was largely reserved for the less delicate. Smoking cigars might earn you a raised brow or a knowing smirk, and pipes were still perfectly acceptable among thinkers and grizzled grandpas alike. But cigarettes? At this point, they were a bit rough around the edges. Homemade. A frayed accessory in a world of lace and fans. Still, people noticed. Slowly, like a rumor whispered at a royal banquet. It helped that around this time, Spanish factories began producing paper-wrapped cigarettes called papelitos. These were made, somewhat surprisingly, not just for adults with philosophical quandaries, but often for poor laborers who needed a cheaper, handier smoke. At only a few inches long, papelitos became the working class's pocket-sized rebellion. And from Spain, they travelled, often tucked into satchels and ship hulls, making their way to France, Italy, and the Ottoman Empire, where tobacco culture was already a rich and smoky tapestry. The Turkish rolled cigarette, from which modern cigarettes derive more than you'd think, had been quietly flourishing for a while. Their blend of strong, sun-cured leaves and fine rolling made them famously flavorful and dreadfully addictive. By the mid-19th century, as industrial revolutions hummed and train smoke tangled with city fog, cigarettes were ready for their smoky glow-up. But before mechanized miracles took over and packaging became printed propaganda, the act of hand-rolling remained common. It was almost meditative. Tear the paper, crumble the tobacco, roll just so, and tap the finished product like it was a wand about to conjure thoughts or calm, or, more often than not, chest congestion. Of course, doctors of the era had opinions. Some believed tobacco was a panacea. Others weren't so sure about frequent deep breathing of combustible flora. But science, at this point, was too busy trying to explain where babies came from to focus much on the lungs. As railroads roared and empires unfolded their maps like oversized napkins, the cigarette nestled itself into cultures both refined and rugged. Not quite mainstream yet, but no longer a clandestine curiosity. A smoke that fit in a pocket, between fingers, or behind the ear of a factory worker dreaming of cigarettes that rolled themselves. And just beyond the industrial horizon, a young man in North Carolina was tinkering with a machine that could roll over 100 cigarettes per minute. But that, dear listener, is a puff for another evening's tale. For now, let the soft clatter of trolley bells and the whisper of horse hooves on cobblestones lull you toward the next quiet turn in history's dreamy spiral. The late 1800s were a time of tremendous change. Horse-drawn carriages danced nervously out of the way of newfangled automobiles. Parasols trembled at the edge of the electric age. And beards, glorious, wizard-like beards, seemed to be getting shorter by the year, as if adjusting themselves to the modern breeze. And somewhere amid this shuffle of centuries, something curious began curling through the air: cigarette smoke. While tobacco had already been around the globe twice over, in pipes, in snuffs, in cigars longer than your forearm, the cigarette, that slim paper-wrapped imp of indulgence, was still finding its fashionable footing. It was not always so neatly rolled and universally carried. In fact, the earliest versions of cigarettes bore a strong resemblance to a papier-mâché experiment gone wrong. Take, for instance, Spanish soldiers during the Napoleonic Wars. They didn't have bespoke Marlboros tucked into shirt sleeves. Instead, they tore pages from books or newspapers and rolled up bits of cigar ends, probably while mumbling about inflation and missing toes. Eventually, the French, in their eternal pursuit of making life more elegant and arguably more flammable, took these crumpled contraptions and gave them a name: cigarettes, which sounds delightfully breezy when pronounced with a French accent and slightly ominous if whispered during a thunderstorm. The true turning point for the cigarette came not from a glamorous Parisian salon or a poetic martyr lighting up before a duel, but rather from, as is so often the case in human history, a machine. Enter James Bonsack, a young man quite determined to mechanize monotony. In 1880, in the United States, he patented a cigarette rolling machine. Now, prior to this, one could roll perhaps 4 cigarettes per minute if you're blessed with nimble fingers and considerable patience. But the Bonsack machine gobbled up tobacco and paper and spit out 200 cigarettes per minute, which sounds like the Industrial Revolution had just poked the tobacco industry awake with a soot-covered stick. This invention didn't just produce cigarettes faster, it changed the culture. Where once the cigarette was a casual creation, rolled perhaps more out of frugality than flair, it now became mass-produced, packaged, and primed for mass consumption. Like most seductions of convenience, it slipped into society easily, with a puff and a sigh. Advertising, always the willing accomplice of vice, wasted no time. Cigarettes were soon sold as symbols of sophistication, rebellion, charm, athleticism, and in some curious 20th century ads, even good digestion. Nothing says I'm heartburn-free like lighting a match in your mouth, apparently. By the turn of the century, cigarette smoking had become a mark of the modern man. And increasingly, the modern woman too. In a world where corsets were loosening and ankles were scandalously visible, the cigarette became a symbol of liberation. There was something bold about it, like sipping tea with your pinky up while riding a motorcycle. Smokers weren't just participants, they were performers in the theatre of cool. Yet even then, the smoke was never entirely without shadows. Cranky physicians, bless their early skepticism, had already taken issue with this new popular pastime. In the early 1900s, reports popped up, quietly as coughs in a crowded room, suggesting that maybe, just maybe, inhaling smoke every day wasn't the best life strategy. But the murmur of concern was easily drowned out by the glamorous purr of marketing, which declared these slim sticks of tobacco to be stress relievers, breath fresheners, and, bizarrely, even a way to lose weight, "Smoke your lunch," said the ads, "and look like a flapper." And so, the cigarette, once a battlefield workaround and afterthought, became one of the defining props of the 20th century, wrapped in romance, rebellion, and a perfect flick of ash. But while the stage was filled with smoke and allure, there were others watching from the wings, quietly skeptical, quietly scientific, and quietly preparing to tug the curtain back just a little. Because sweet dreams, as we know, aren't always made of puff and paper. Next, we'll drift into the curious world of tobacco advertising, a place where camels wore sunglasses, physicians gave winks, and cartoon mascots got suspiciously persuasive. By the close of the 19th century, cigarette smoking was tiptoeing from curiously fashionable to utterly unavoidable, like an enthusiastic accordion player at a quiet picnic. The world had changed, and so had the way people inhaled tiny clouds of combusted leaf. What had once been an elaborate ritual full of pipes, pouches, and matches that always seemed to run out was rapidly turning into the pocket-sized flick and light affair we'd recognize today. You see, up until the late 1800s, most tobacco consumers still fancied pipes, snuff, or hand-rolled cigarettes. And rolling your own wasn't something you did because you were edgy or hipster. It was just all there was. Rolling papers came in little booklets. Tobacco came loose. And your fingers, if nimble and coordinated, were your best tools. Otherwise, every attempt resembled a crumbling parchment scroll, bound for a museum exhibit titled Poor Decisions. But then, in 1880, everything changed with the arrival of a machine that sounded like it had a mustache and a monocle. It was called the Bonsack machine, and it was basically a Victorian-era robot that could roll cigarettes faster than a room full of over-caffeinated apprentices. Invented by James Albert Bonsack. Yes, his name sounds like an especially formal goat. The machine could churn out about 120,000 cigarettes a day. Let that sink in. While someone was laboriously hand-rolling 20 smokes in an hour, the Bonsack machine was puffing out tens of thousands without even taking a tea break. Enter James Buchanan Duke. If this were a bedtime soap opera, and it very nearly was, he'd be the sharply dressed tobacco tycoon waving dramatically from his veranda. Duke made a deal with Bonsack to use the machine at a discounted rate and keep competitors in the dark. This secret mechanical alliance gave Duke a laughably enormous advantage and allowed him to crush the competition like a soggy cigar at a garden party. Duke's American Tobacco Company soon flooded the market with machine-made cigarettes, which were cheaper, more uniform, and packaged in cozy little boxes that practically begged to be bought. And oh, how they were bought. By the crate, by the carton, by the pocketful. Advertising helped, of course. And by helped, I mean turned smoking into a cultural juggernaut. Posters, trading cards, appearances in silent films. Cigarettes became the dashing sidekick of modern life. One puff, and you too could become glamorous, mysterious, and conveniently flammable. But here, dear listener, we must lightly tiptoe through the halls of irony. For not long after cigarettes became massive cultural symbols, the machinery of regulation decided to peek in suspiciously. You may find it comforting to know that the world has always needed something to worry about, and by the early 20th century, cigarettes became a popular target. Health concerns, anti-smoking campaigns, and accusations of moral corruption sprang up loudly from circles of reformers and physicians. Of course, science and public health didn't move quickly. Back then, discovering a link between smoking and health problems was a bit like trying to solve a crossword using a telescope. Slow, distant, and filled with guesses. Still, some people definitely noticed something was up. A few doctors whispered about mysterious lung ailments, and in 1906, the US Pure Food and Drug Act took its first baby steps into tobacco regulation, not banning it, mind you, but at least keeping an eye on what went into it. Spoiler alert, it wasn't kale. The thing is, the cigarette's rise was as much about psychology as it was about smoke. It was convenient. It was modern. It was, you'll love this, seen as more hygienic than chewing tobacco or communal pipes. Yes, you heard that right. In an era of shared spittoons and public pipes, slipping a filtered tube of burning plant matter between your lips was considered posh. And so, the cigarette walked confidently into the industrial age, hand in hand with advertising, mass production, and a curious human tendency to romanticize smoke. There's something eternally dreamy about how people attempt to make chaos elegant. A puff of grey curling into a street lamp's glow, a sigh exhaled between wars and worries. As you drift ever deeper into velvet slumber, picture old factories alive with the clack, clack, clack of cigarette machines, turning human restlessness into routine. Picture top hats, bustling boulevards, and the smoky breath of a transforming century. Ahead, we'll wander into the smoky lounges of the 1920s, where jazz mingled with nicotine and everything, for a moment, felt like a dream made of velvet and static. While Victorian London was many things, foggy, poetic, unsettlingly horse-scented, it was also quite the puffing paradise. The 19th century saw not only the rise of the moustache as a measure of manliness, but also an explosion in the popularity of smoking. And not just any smoking. Cigarettes were climbing the social ladder with the speed and confidence of a cat burglar in a terribly written penny novel. It's easy to think of cigarettes as a 20th century phenomenon, conjuring madmen and movie stars brooding in black and white. But the cigarette's paper-wrapped journey began slower and smokier than you'd think, filtering through centuries like a lazy Sunday wind. By the early 1800s, the pipe still reigned supreme, preferred by philosophers, peasants, and dandies alike. There were also cigars, the chunkier cousins of the cigarette, often seen clenched between the teeth of revolutionaries or failing novelists. But cigarettes, they were still the scrawny younger sibling, occasionally showing up at the social party, but never quite stealing the spotlight. In fact, the clever little cigarette owes quite the debt to war, which, as grim as it sounds, has historically been big for business. During the Crimean War in the 1850s, British soldiers found themselves mingling with their Ottoman allies, who had already gotten cozy with hand-rolled cigarettes. The Brits, perhaps bored of pipe maintenance and eager for something a bit more portable, took up the habit with gusto. They also noticed that the cigarette was like the pocket-sized diary of tobacco, compact, discreet, and deeply personal. When those war-weary Brits returned home, they brought their newfound puffs with them. And as the Victorian age progressed with its chimneys and steam trains and endlessly polite scandalings, the fashionable cigarette began to flicker into daily life. It took a while, naturally. Tobacco culture doesn't turn on a sixpence. But slowly, packs of cigarettes began to be sold commercially. At first, of course, they were hand-rolled, which sounds charming to us now, but was a deeply impractical business model. Think of it like boutique cupcake production in an age of famine. Someone had to roll each one. Tedious, time-consuming, and terribly unprofitable, unless you had an army of underpaid enthusiasts or extremely fast fingers. Enter one James Albert Bonsack, an American inventor who once looked at the problem of hand-rolled cigarettes and said, in essence, "Well, I can fix that, probably with gears." In 1881, he patented a cigarette rolling machine that could churn out thousands of smokes daily, a revelation both for smokers and for lovers of industrial-sized innovation. You could say that Bonsack was the Henry Ford of unconscious lung damage. His machine helped vault cigarettes from artisan luxury to mass-market obsession. And by the 1890s, smoking as a social pastime had developed layers. There were morning cigarettes, post-dinner cigarettes, poetic cigarettes lit during long stares from balconies. Some enthusiasts even had a special cigarette for waiting for the train, another for missing the train, and one more for pretending they didn't mind missing the train. Much like umbrellas and awkward silences, cigarettes became part of the fabric of Victorian life. Interestingly, for women, the rules were still quite foggy. While men could light up practically anywhere and be seen as rakish or romantic, smoking women were often whispered about, as if each puff made them a little too daring for polite society. It was common in many parts of Europe for women to smoke in private, but rarely in public, unless they were rebels, artists, or simply out of patience for decorum. Still, the cigarette continued its rise, propelled by clever marketing, changing social mores, and a growing sense that to smoke was to exude a certain something. Whether that something was mystery, sophistication, or an unfortunate hacking cough remained unclear. By the turn of the century, cigarette smoking was slipping its way into offices, boudoirs, and even royal courts. Kings puffed thoughtfully while ignoring constitutional crises. Artists smoked in pursuit of the perfect metaphor, and ordinary citizens lit up not out of rebellion, but routine. And thus, in the shadowy lull between centuries, the cigarette had become more than habit. It was a smoky punctuation mark on the sentence of modernity. One moment you're writing telegrams in Morse code. The next, you're leaning against a lamppost, exhaling drama on a city street. Smoky nights would only grow thicker from here, and in the following quiet stretch of time, the cigarettes would start to travel even further, across oceans, through trenches, and into silver screen legend. But that's a story for when the night whispers closer, and the smoke drifts into dreams. In the dusky swirl of the late 1800s, while monocles were getting slightly less fashionable and mustaches were becoming slightly more twirlable, something else was quietly slipping into the fabric of everyday life. The manufactured cigarette. Yes, the dainty paper-wrapped stick that would come to typify rebellion, stress, sophistication, and, at times, questionable judgment. But before it starred in black and white films and wartime rations, it had to be built, quite literally. That story begins with a man named James Bonsack, a rather industrious fellow, in that crank handle and coffee grinder sort of way. In 1880, he invented a cigarette rolling machine, perhaps unaware that his mechanical brainchild would end up reshaping the tobacco industry and filling the air with swirls of paper-filtered smoke for centuries to come. Before Bonsack, cigarettes were still crafted mostly by hand. A skilled roller could craft maybe 5 a minute, which was fine during leisurely Ottoman afternoons when time wasn't money. It was more of a suggestion. But Bonsack's begoggled contraption could churn out over 100 cigarettes a minute. It didn't blink, didn't eat lunch, didn't get distracted reading serialized detective stories, a capitalist's dream, or perhaps a cough waiting to happen. Enter James Buchanan Duke, an American tobacco tycoon whose beard could only be described as boss level. He took one look at Bonsack's machine and said, more or less, "Splendid, I'll take several." Duke, later of Duke University fame, essentially out-industrialized the market. With his new mechanical ciggy churners, He crushed the handmade competition like a man squashing a bug under his velvet boot, albeit a very genteel one. And so, cigarette smoking began to accelerate, not just in the United States, but around the world. What was once a niche habit found mostly in Mediterranean cafes and aristocratic ennui circles now became something everyone could hold between their fingers. The cigarette wasn't just affordable, it was fashionable. Part of that, of course, was marketing. Oh, and what marketing it was. Duke's Company, American Tobacco Company, pioneered the use of collectible cards tucked inside cigarette packs. These weren't just any cards. We're talking baseball stars, actresses, flags of obscure nations, and even cats doing very little, which is to say, being cats. It was the original loot box, and it worked. People got hooked, quite literally and figuratively. Now let us dim the light slightly and drift into the early 20th century, when cigarettes marched proudly into history's bigger theatres, the trenches and the silver screen. During World War I, cigarettes were not just popular, they were considered essential. Soldiers received them in their ration kits, alongside hardtack biscuits and that peculiar brand of trench poetry that rhymed death with Beth. The logic was simple. A few puffs between bombardments offered solace, camaraderie, and occasionally a handy way to detect wind direction. Meanwhile, Hollywood took the cigarette and gave it its most glamorous makeover yet. If you've ever wondered why every film noir detective looks like he smells of bourbon and unresolved trauma, thank a cigarette. Suddenly, cigarettes were in the hands of heroes, villains, and everyone in between. Blown softly in back alleys, across velvet lounges, or from the lips of someone delivering a witty one-liner before vanishing into fog and jazz. Cigarettes, once an elite indulgence or curious novelty, were now a daily ritual for millions. By the 1920s, you could barely walk a block in New York City without passing a corner newsstand wallpapered in tobacco advertisements promising vigor, sophistication, or possibly the affections of Margaret from accounting. And it would continue to grow. With each puff, the modern world passed from the agricultural age into the industrial age, and then, in a faint haze of ash and ambition, into something entirely new. But even as the smoke curled upward, whispers began to rise, quiet ones, disbelieved and brushed aside, hints that perhaps behind the glamour and the aroma, there might lurk another story, one of lungs and lab coats, and quiet studies filed away in medical journals no one wanted to read. Not yet. Not while the world was still humming its tobacco lullaby. Now, as the stars tilt their gaze toward our next chapter, let's tiptoe further into the smoky corridors of history, where glamour begins to fray and truth flickers just beneath the surface, as the sooty curls of cigarette smoke drifted their way across the rhythm of history. A new scene unfurled. Not palaces or patent offices, but zinc counters and chrome stools. We find ourselves now in the comforting fluorescence of mid-20th century America, where coffee was served black, jukeboxes blinked beside the milkshake blenders, and ashtrays were affixed to everything that didn't move. Possibly even some things that did. It's the late 1950s, baby. Eisenhower is trimming the federal budget. Teenagers are discovering the twist, the dance, and the emotional mood. And the act of lighting a cigarette has reached peak cinematic glamour. Smoking was not only socially acceptable, it was practically a moral obligation if you had cheekbones and dialogue. Cary Grant did it. Audrey Hepburn made it look like ballet. Even doctors, or at least the ones who starred in TV ads, were puffing away between house calls. Yes, strange as it may seem, physicians were once the unlikely poster children for big tobacco. Magazine spreads from the era nonchalantly declared, "More doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette." As if shifting your stethoscope to one side just to light up was a crucial step in diagnosing a patient's sore throat. This was a time when cigarette vending machines stood proudly in restaurants, next to coat racks and payphones, as if nicotine were just another seasoning for life. Dropping coins into those mechanical vendors of smoky sin was not unlike summoning a spirit, or at least a mentholated breeze. With a satisfying clunk, out came a pack, all wrapped in shiny foil with a paper pull tab, just begging to be noticed like the ruffle of a debutante's dress. Marketing during this golden age of smoking was nothing short of genius, with a capital G. That's problematic. Advertisers poured their creativity into transforming tiny tubes of dried leaves into items of culture, rebellion, sophistication, or whatever feeling would gently nudge a consumer toward addiction with a smile. And oh, the slogans. "You've come a long way, baby," purred at the emerging market of cigarette-smoking women. Winston tastes good, like a cigarette should, as if the cigarette and you had a shared destiny, possibly involving polyester pantsuits and shag carpeting. Of course, the tobacco industry also had to navigate an increasingly whispery concern among scientists that perhaps inhaling burning plant matter into your lungs dozens of times per day might not be entirely consequence-free. But rather than putting out the fire, so to speak, manufacturers simply offered filtered cigarettes. "Here, have some perforated paper and a plastic tip, and please lean back into your cloud of denial." Meanwhile, people got creative with how and where they smoked. Take the smoking jackets of a generation ago, velvety, quilted garments worn by gentlemen to protect their clothes while luxuriating in post-dinner nicotine fog like self-appointed barons of leisure. Smoking jackets transformed one's living room into a casual drawing room for the comfortably flammable. In more public spaces, etiquette around smoking became its own subtle ballet. Lighting someone's cigarette was the height of gallantry, akin to offering your coat in a rainstorm. Except the coat was carcinogenic. Ashes were tapped with a kind of social finesse, never too soon, never too late, and ideally into something porcelain and vaguely Grecian. But even as smoking was grasping for the stars, so too was the scientific community peeking nervously at the growing stack of medical studies. Whispered rumors turned into reports which transformed into hearings, raising sticky questions. How healthy was it really to coat one's lungs in tar? Was that hacking cough romantic or just the early warning lights? The tension grew under the surface like slow-building thunder. The world hadn't quit yet, but it had started to clear its throat, a dry, itchy warning of change to come. And so we linger here, in this moment of poised contradiction. Ashtrays brimming beside family dinners, cartons shoved into Christmas stockings like it was the most thoughtful gift a person could give. A culture both obsessed with vitality and pleasantly fogged by smoke. The smoke, of course, is never content to linger in one age. It drifts forward, curling around the edges of something new. A shift is coming. Change, not quick, but persistent, begins to smolder just beneath the surface. And as that whisper of change starts to rise, let us follow its trail gently into what comes next. As the clock ticked softly into the velvet hush of the early 1900s, the world found itself swept into a haze of change, scented faintly of tobacco and revolution. By now, smoking wasn't just a cultural quirk or a tribal ceremony. It was quickly becoming a symbol of modern life, a smoky punctuation mark to 20th century identity. With the industrial world crackling to life and light bulbs slowly pushing back the darkness, it seemed even habits were going electric, or at the very least, mass-produced. Enter the cigarette's golden age, by which, of course, we mean golden. In that peculiar way humans decide a thing is fantastic once it's stuffed into every pocket, billboard, and movie screen. See, up until the late 1800s, cigarettes were mostly handmade, laboriously rolled like little tobacco burritos by people with nimble fingers and strong opinions about paper thickness. But then came James Bonsack, an American inventor whose name sadly never made it into hip-hop lyrics, despite what he did for the industry. In 1880, he built a machine that could roll cigarettes faster than any hand could dream, a staggering 120,000 of the things a day. It was less a technological marvel and more a tobacco typhoon. Now, here's where you might expect the story to veer into boardrooms, monocles, and sinister deals. And yes, there were plenty of those. But there was also one man with an epically confident mustache and a marketing plan so cunning it could have sold crumpets to the French. His name, James Buchanan Duke. Mr. Duke, with the help of the Bonsack machine, cornered the market. He sold cigarettes nationwide at prices so low, rivals simply curled up and cried into their burlap sacks of unsold tobacco. By the early 20th century, Duke's empire had helped make cigarettes the go-to tobacco option, though still not quite the social staple they would become. That honor, oddly enough, would be bestowed by two great influences of the era, war and cinema. Let's start with war, particularly the First World War, which, like your cousin's wedding playlist, seemed to go on far too long and leave everyone slightly traumatized. In the trenches, cigarettes became a comfort, a brief moment of normalcy between the symphony of mud, rats, and poetry. Military rations often included cigarettes because nothing says thanks for charging across barbed wire like a complimentary smoke. Soldiers returned home clinging to certain trench habits, and the cigarette came with them. Soon, smoking took on the rugged, stoic aura of men who'd seen unspeakable things, and now just wanted to relax with a lucky strike. Meanwhile, on the silver screen, Hollywood was creating a different kind of war, one fought with glances, gestures, and generous puffs of mystery. The 1920s and 30s dripped with noir glamour, and whether you were Humphrey Bogart or one of 10 actors impersonating him, a cigarette was practically your co-star. It curled from elegant fingers like a swan's neck, its smoke trailing off into scripts, symbolism, and vague existential questions. Even women, who for decades were discouraged from smoking, unless they preferred to be judged by Victorian aunties playing whist, picked up the habit, but only after some clever PR. In 1929, Edward Bernays, famed father of public relations and probable inventor of the term spin doctor, orchestrated the Torches of Freedom event. He hired women to smoke while marching in a New York City parade, an act framed as feminist defiance. Suddenly, lighting up wasn't just stylish, it was revolutionary. And the cigarette, once a humble peasant in the kingdom of snuff and cigar dynasties, had been crowned the king of the smolder. By this point, smoking had truly gone mainstream. It was no longer just a ritual, it was a rhythm of daily life. Lighting a cigarette felt like pressing the play button on a moment of contemplation, rebellion, or just vague attempts to look cool at the bus stop. But the empire of ash would not go unchallenged forever. Science, with its microscopes and lab coats suspiciously immune to marketing, was quietly assembling its case. And in the glow of the mid-century morning, a strange breeze was beginning to blow. one laced with suspicion, X-rays, and very small mice in even smaller lab cages. Let us quietly drift now into the lantern-lit drawing rooms of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a time when moustaches were princely, telegrams buzzed like caffeinated bees, and the world was moving steadily from the parlour to the factory. It was within this hinge of time that the cigarette finally puffed into prominence with the full force of industrial ambition and societal nonchalance. You see, cigarettes had been around for centuries, as we've gently meandered through, but they had remained something of a slow art, rolled by hand, smoked in secluded corners, and often shared like secrets, until the industrial machine said, "Well now, let's make this a bit more efficient, shall we?" Enter one Mr. James Buchanan Duke. Yes, Duke, as in the fellow who later donated so much money that a whole university was named after him. But before he was funding scholarships and Gothic archways, he was revolutionizing smoking with a machine, specifically the Bonsack machine. Now, sounds charming, doesn't it? Bonsack, like a kindly birdwatcher, or a fellow who makes nice chairs. But it was actually a mechanical whirlwind. The Bonsack machine could roll thousands of cigarettes a day, far faster than human fingers and without requiring tea breaks. Thanks to Mr. Duke's canny business sense and an exclusive contract with the Bonsack folks, he essentially industrialized the cigarette. Poof. Overnight, the once leisurely hand-rolled smoke became a shiny, mass-produced marvel. Well, marvel might be generous, but certainly available. And as the cigarettes themselves became more accessible, they also received a stylish rebrand. Marketing, after all, had entered a golden age of its own. Companies began to sell not just tobacco leaf in paper tubes, but entire lifestyles. Ads promised status, sophistication, and occasionally even health, which, looking back, feels about as ironic as selling marshmallows as fireproof. Some early 20th century advertisements suggested that cigarettes could soothe your throat, relieve asthma, and even help with digestion. Camel cigarettes once dared you to compare. More doctors smoked Camels than any other cigarette, which was absolutely true. Assuming you polled only the doctors who smoked Camels around the same period, women were largely discouraged from smoking in public, seen as unladylike, unwholesome, or just too delightfully rebellious. But then came a curious moment in the 1920s when Edward Bernays, a nephew of Sigmund Freud, and something like the Mozart of public relations, decided to change that. He orchestrated a now famous stunt during a New York City Easter parade, recruiting women to light up cigarettes and declare them torches of freedom. And just like that, smoking became not only liberating but fashionable. A puff of smoke rebranded as empowerment. Meanwhile, in the trenches of World War I and World War II, cigarettes became standard military rations. Soldiers were handed packets alongside bullets and biscuits. It was seen as a bit of calm in an unrelenting storm, a brief, smoky exhale in between thunder. By the time these soldiers returned home, lighting a cigarette felt less like a habit and more like a ritual. Back in civilian life, cinema took the baton and sprinted off with it. Hollywood helped immortalize the cigarette as an emblem of mystery and control. Humphrey Bogart flicking ash with poetic angst, or Audrey Hepburn with her impossibly long holder, turning smoke into choreography. And yet, behind the glamour, a slow fog of concern was beginning to rise. Some scientists were starting to ask awkward questions. Questions like, why do the lungs of smokers look like overcooked brisket? Or, is that persistent cough supposed to happen? But the answers when they finally arrived, would take decades to settle in, and for a long while, the cigarette held its throne in society, lit by industrial machines, glamorized by marketers, and passed from fingers to lips like a comforting secret. It's strange, isn't it? How something that begins as sacred ritual and social gesture can end up as factory product and fashion accessory. How smoke can drift from ceremony to industry in only a few generations. Now, let's gently exhale and watch the last curls fade from the end of a cigarette in a silver ashtray. Maybe somewhere in a dimly lit jazz club, or beside a typewriter that has written 1,000 stories. Because next, dear dreamer, we'll wander further into that smoky modern age, where quiet rebellions took new form, and public health began to pull back the velvet curtain. As the 20th century quietly unrolled itself like a fresh page of Sunday's newspaper, crisp, brimming with industrial bravado and a distaste for silence, cigarettes were quickly becoming far more than bundles of finely shredded leaves. They were props in the theatre of modernity. Think of it. Jazz in smoky speakeasies, trench coats in black and white films, and a thin plume of smoke curling from the corners of red-lipped grins or furrowed brows. Ah, the golden age of cinematic smolder and pulmonary diseases. Marketing, dear listener, took puffing to prophetic levels. Before marketing, cigarettes were pretty much humble sticks of dried stuff, plant-based and rolled by hand, sometimes by your Aunt Mildred between knitting mittens and murmuring about the war. But post-marketing, they became symbols of freedom, of glamour, of personal rebellion, and even, remarkably, of medical virtue. Yes, medical. Put on your historical slippers and tiptoe back to the 1930s and 40s, when advertisements cheerily claimed that certain brands were less irritating to the throat than others. Some featured doctors, real ones, or at least men pretending rather convincingly with timely spectacles and appropriate mustaches, who endorsed tobacco with the same approval they might give a glass of orange juice. More doctors smoked Camels, read one famous campaign from 1946, gently ignoring the fact that doctors also used leeches and thought radium water was a nice pick-me-up. The common image of the cigarette began to flourish under these smoky halos. Among the masses, the workers' cigarette break became a small rebellion against the tyranny of the time clock. Men and women alike would step outside, lean against brick walls, and gaze meaningfully into the middle distance, while nicotine threaded little lullabies through their veins. Cigarettes were breaks, cigarettes were bonds, cigarettes were entire moods. Then Hollywood sauntered in, top hat, attitude and all. Film noir adored cigarettes, the soft ember of philosophy and danger, the slow draw of a line just before a gunfight or a kiss. Humphrey Bogart could have held a paperclip between his fingers for dramatic intrigue, but something about a cigarette just made everything purr more deeply. By the 1950s, it was almost un-American not to be smoking. If you weren't lighting up, were you even awake? And then we arrive at a fascinating little corner of history, where branding became a kind of sorcery. Picture this: crisp packaging, soothing fonts, and exotic names like Lucky Strike and Chesterfield. They sounded less like cigarettes and more like charming British nephews. Tobacco companies aligned themselves with sports, war efforts, and even women's liberation. The first campaign targeting female smokers told them they could reach for a lucky instead of a sweet. Because naturally, the two options for modern womanhood were nougats or nicotine. But it wasn't just the flavor of freedom being sold. It was tailored identity. Marlboro, for instance, began not as the rugged cowboy brand we now associate with dusty machismo and boot spurs. but as a cigarette aimed at fashionable women. The red band around the filter tip, that was designed to hide lipstick smudges. Truly, nothing says gender-specific marketing like manipulating shade transfer. It wasn't until the 1960s that tides began to shift. The Surgeon General issued a report in 1964 linking smoking to lung cancer, a truly shocking revelation if you'd spent the previous 3 decades believing tobacco soothed the throat like a warm shawl. This marked the beginning of the slow, if rather polite, societal uninviting of cigarettes from the modern party. Public opinion began to wheeze. Cigarette ads were banned from television and radio by 1971 in the United States. By the 1980s and 90s, smouldering away indoors became taboo, unless you were a birthday cake. But even in the face of science and public health, there remained pockets of nostalgic puffery. Pipes and cigars clung to the fringes like elderly actors who'd once played the lead roles. Some people shifted to light cigarettes, hoping the word alone might offset any unpleasant truths. Others turned to alternatives, nicotine gum, patches, and eventually, vapes shaped like futuristic USB drives. Because if tobacco history teaches us anything, it's that humans can't resist rolling something up and lighting it on fire, especially if it makes them look vaguely philosophical. So as the world turned ever more digital and smoke-free, cigarettes left behind not just ashes, but whole eras of aesthetic and absurdity. They had been everything: fashion statement, stress relief, health claim, social salve, and in some curious way, an archive of human uncertainty. Now, with the smoke slowly clearing and history still swirling its long cloak around us, we drift toward one final story. A final puff, if you will, on this embered tale of inhale and exhale. As the smoke of history begins to curl into the quiet night, we find ourselves in the final flickering moments of a very peculiar odyssey. An adventure filled with herbal experiments, dubious health claims, and tiny paper tubes that danced across centuries like gossip at a royal banquet. By the early 20th century, cigarettes had sauntered their way from exotic curiosity to global pastime. With machine-rolled production booming and advertising departments firing on all cylinders, the humble cigarette became less a leaf and more a lifestyle. Nothing says modern adult like inhaling dried vegetable matter with conviction, or so the billboards insisted. Doctors, in their starched white coats, were paraded in magazine ads, nodding pensively beside slogans like "More doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette." Of course, that statistic may have been gathered by peeking into hospital break rooms and tallying who hadn't switched to pipe tobacco out of rebellion. Meanwhile, Hollywood got in on the act. Movie stars puffed on screen not merely as a plot device, but often just to look fabulously disinterested. James Dean practically made an entire career out of smouldering glances with a smouldering cigarette. Somewhere, a smoke wafted elegantly over Clark Gable's shoulder, whispering to the audience, "This man knows heartbreak and leisure in equal measure." Governments, ever alert to the scent of tax revenue, embraced tobacco like a long-lost cousin who just won the lottery. Wars made cigarettes downright patriotic. World War I saw soldiers ration their smokes like gold. In World War II, a cigarette and a steel helmet went together like tea and biscuits. An odd, but oddly comforting pair. Tobacco companies sent care packages to soldiers, not just from goodwill, but because a future customer base was being seasoned in the trenches. Post-war, things escalated. Big tobacco went big. So did the warnings. Whispered voices in labs had begun to wonder, what if these feather-light whiffs were not, in fact, as harmless as they seemed? In 1964, the US Surgeon General declared what many already suspected. Perhaps, just perhaps, inhaling repeatedly from a burning stick full of dried leaves and assorted additives was not great for human lungs. Who would have thunk? The report linked smoking to cancer, heart disease, and the occasional existential rant at family reunions. The age of caution had arrived, puffing quietly on a filtered alternative. Suddenly, the cigarette lost a little of its lace-trimmed allure. Ad bans rolled in. Warning labels grew bolder and more poetic in their despair. Even cartoon mascots like Joe Camel were muscled off stage, presumably to a desert somewhere, where he puffed alone under a melancholy moon. Yet the story wasn't finished. Cigarette culture adapted, mutated, and, in a play worthy of a Shakespearean tragedy, rebranded. The 21st century brought us vape pens, nicotine patches, herbal alternatives, and an emerging generation that looked upon traditional cigarettes with the curious disdain one reserves for powdered wigs and rotary phones. They'd found newer ways to flirt with rebellion and, occasionally, peppermint-scented fog. But even as we leave the era of ashtrays and cufflink lighters, the remnants linger. There's a whole language of gestures passed down from smoky parlours and rebellious jazz clubs. The flick of a lighter, the lean-in chat with a stranger beneath the awning of a rainy sidewalk cafe, the long exhale that wasn't about the cigarette at all, but a moment of pause. Cigarettes, in all their controversial charm, have been mirrors to our times. They've reflected the elegance we craved, the danger we flirted with, and the fleeting nature of indulgence itself. And so we stub out this final ember in our long and dreamy stroll through smoking's curious past. From sacred rituals to space-age substitutes, we've inhaled the odd, the absurd, and the quietly fascinating. Now, with a gentle breath out and a soft sigh into your pillow, let the smoke of centuries drift away. May your dreams be filtered only by comfort, wrapped in the smoothest of metaphors and utterly blissfully cigarette-free. Sleep well, historian.